The conversation begins on an unexpectedly warm, personal note. Pierre Poilievre arrives not as a stiff opposition leader but as a guest trying to connect, presenting Joe Rogan with a custom 70-pound kettlebell chosen to match Rogan's preferred weight. The gift is carefully tailored, engraved with Rogan references including "seeing is believing," a nod to early UFC branding, and a Miyamoto Musashi quote Rogan often repeats: "If you know the way broadly, you will see it in everything." Poilievre jokes that it even carries a subliminal maple leaf message, meant to lure Rogan back to Canada and help tourism. That light gesture quickly turns into genuine bonding over strength training. Poilievre calls himself a big kettlebell freak, and the two slip easily into a mini history of the tool. He explains that kettlebells originated in Russian markets as counterweights for produce like potatoes and barley. Farmers began swinging and lifting them competitively at fairs, and eventually the Russian military adopted them. He traces the modern North American boom to Pavel Tsatsouline and the strong first system, while adding that ancient China had comparable strength implements, even if not cast-iron kettlebells. The exchange matters because it positions Poilievre squarely inside Rogan's world of training, martial arts, and practical self-improvement. He argues that kettlebells build more useful strength than dumbbells because real life rarely offers smooth, isolated resistance. Actual force is explosive, awkward, and unstable, more like fighting, wrestling, or lifting an uneven object. He highlights the catapult effect of a proper kettlebell snatch, where the bell becomes nearly weightless at the top when executed correctly. Rogan responds with obvious enthusiasm, calling kettlebells one of the best exercise tools he has ever used. That shared passion sets the tone for everything that follows. Instead of opening with partisan conflict, the episode begins with discipline, function, and mutual respect for physical culture. By the time politics enters the conversation, Poilievre has already established himself as someone who values effort, history, and practical competence, a smart foundation for winning over an audience often skeptical of politicians. Poilievre describes his path into politics as beginning less with ideology than with frustration, injury, and boredom. As a teenager, he was deeply involved in sports, especially wrestling, and thought he was good, if not exceptional, until what he calls wicked tendinitis in his shoulder sidelined him for about 4 years. Losing athletics left a void, and looking for something meaningful to do after school, he asked his mother to take him to local conservative meetings. Politics, in his account, became the new outlet that replaced the challenge and purpose sports had provided. Asked where those instincts came from, he traces them to his upbringing in South Calgary. He was adopted by 2 schoolteachers after being born to a 16-year-old single mother, and he grew up in a suburban community surrounded by electricians, oil workers, police officers, and other working people. From that environment, he says, he developed the sense that people like his neighbors were being ignored and mistreated by the political class. In Western Canada, he says, that feeling was known as Western alienation. He points to Preston Manning and the Reform movement as an early inspiration, recalling a billboard of Manning with a raised fist and the word, "enough," that immediately struck him. He also immersed himself in political reading, citing both Fidel Castro biographies and Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom as formative influences. From that mix, he says, he developed a philosophy grounded in maximizing personal, financial, and religious freedom while limiting government's role in private life. What emerges is a blend of regional grievance, self-education, and respect for ordinary workers. Poilievre repeatedly argues that regular people often understand real economic consequences better than experts in Ottawa, and that politics should begin with trust in common sense rather than administrative control. He ties that worldview to the romance of his first political internship, where at 16 or 17 he earned $600 a month, spent nearly 2 hours each way commuting by train and bus, and wore a used suit and second-hand shoes bought by his father. The story underscores the image he wants to present, a politician shaped not by elite institutions, but by discipline, ambition, and a belief that ordinary Canadians were being left behind. Rogan says his long-standing admiration for Canada has turned to alarm. He describes Canadians as polite, trusting, and orderly, America with like 20% less bullshit, but argues those traits became liabilities under Justin Trudeau, whom he casts as a wolf in sheep's clothing. In Rogan's view, Trudeau's mild public image masked a sharp illiberal turn, especially during COVID. The trucker protests and the freezing of bank accounts belonging to convoy donors, he says, shattered his sense of Canada as one of the freest societies in the world. That unease leads into one of the episode's darkest themes, MAID, or medical assistance in dying. Rogan cites the claim that 1 in 20 Canadian deaths is now assisted suicide. His objection is not to assisted dying in every circumstance. He points to his friend Michael Lara, who had ALS and chose to end his life in Oregon, as an example he can understand. What disturbs him is MAID's expansion to cases involving mental illness and younger people. Referencing reports of a young person receiving assisted dying for seasonal depression, he reacts less with policy language than disbelief, asking why no one simply helped. Poilievre offers a more measured but still critical response. He supports personal choice in genuine end-of-life situations, yet firmly opposes MAID for children or for people whose only condition is mental illness. He argues the state's duty is to put every avenue toward life, treatment and recovery on the table before death is ever considered. Bureaucrats, he says, should never suggest MAID to someone seeking help because they are poor, injured, or psychologically struggling. From there, both men shift toward meaning, discipline, and hope. Poilievre argues that exercise matters not only for health, but because it teaches people they can suffer, persist, and emerge stronger. Drawing on Viktor Frankl and logotherapy, he says meaning, not comfort, is what enables people to survive hardship. The shared conclusion is that a humane society should build institutions around recovery, belonging, and resilience, because a country in pain cannot call itself compassionate if it offers death before restoring hope. One of Poilievre's strongest moments comes when he explains Westminster parliamentarism to Rogan as the basis for a broader philosophy of restraint. He recalls meeting Joe Biden on Parliament Hill and introducing himself as the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. When Biden asks how someone can be both loyal and in opposition, Poilievre uses the exchange to explain the British tradition. The opposition is loyal because its job is to hold the government accountable on the public's behalf. He describes Parliament as intentionally adversarial. Unlike the semicircle of the U.S. Congress, Canada's House of Commons places government and opposition on facing sides, historically 2.5 sword lengths apart. For Poilievre, that symbolism captures the point of the institution. The opposition is there to prosecute the hell out of the government and make ministers tremble when they enter the chamber. Parliament, in his telling, is not an extension of executive power but a check on it. He does not work for the government, he says. He works for Parliament, and Parliament works for the people. From there he moves naturally into his governing creed. If he were founding a party from scratch, he says, it would be called the Mind Your Own Damn Business Party. Government should stick to a limited set of core functions, roads, the military, borders, police, and a basic safety net, then leave people free to live their lives. Rogan immediately responds that opposing such a view doesn't even make sense. Poilievre ties that instinct to his larger argument that ordinary people often understand reality better than elite experts. During the COVID era money printing, he says, mechanics and other working people correctly foresaw inflation while politicians and central bankers denied it. If more money floods the economy without more goods and services, prices rise. To him, that is plain common sense ignored or obscured by a managerial class too insulated from everyday life. That case is central to his appeal. He is not just criticizing liberal policy, but arguing that modern governments have become too bossy, too technocratic, and too detached. In unscripted settings, that argument lands because he expresses it through vivid, emotionally resonant images, turning freedom from an abstraction into a promise to restore dignity and autonomy to ordinary people. Rogan brings up a common U.S. political storyline, that Poilievre and his party were on track to win until Donald Trump kept joking, or half-joking, that Canada should become the 51st state. He asks whether that actually changed the mood in Canada. Poilievre says it did. Canadians were offended, he says, and with good reason. Canada's not for sale. Canadians may love Americans as neighbors and friends, but they want to remain sovereign and distinct. He casts that reaction as simple patriotism. Just as Rogan is proud to be American, Poilievre says he is proud to be Canadian. He ties that identity to family history, sacrifice, land, and inheritance, the country where his grandparents came, where his ancestors fought, and where his grandchildren will live. His message to Trump is blunt. Stop saying it so the two countries can get back to serious discussions about what they can achieve together as allies and friends. From there, Poilievre pivots to tariffs and makes a broader case for Canada-U.S. economic cooperation. He says Canada can help America address two major concerns: affordability and security. On affordability, he points to Canada's vast oil reserves, the fourth largest in the world, and argues that because Canadian heavy crude is discounted and export routes are largely north-south, the U.S. benefits from reliable, cheaper energy. He says he wants Canada producing enough to send 2 million more barrels a day to the American market, lowering costs and supporting jobs. He extends the argument to lumber and aluminum. Canada is the top foreign supplier of softwood lumber, he says, so easier trade would help reduce housing costs. He also notes that the Ford F-Series depends heavily on aluminum the U.S. cannot produce in sufficient volume. Tariffs on Canadian aluminum, he argues, do not revive American production. They just make trucks more expensive for workers. His larger point is pragmatic. Tariff-free trade with Canada would lower prices, strengthen supply chains, and support strategic industries, including defense minerals. Asked whether he has made this case directly to Trump, Poilievre says no, invoking his one prime minister at a time rule. Since he lost the election, he says negotiations belong to the sitting prime minister. That lets him criticize Trump's rhetoric while still sounding disciplined, patriotic, and focused on a Canada-U.S. relationship built on respect and practical cooperation. Rogan is struck by how different Canadian elections are from the American system of fixed presidential terms. Poilievre explains that, although Canada has scheduled election dates, governments can fall earlier if they lose a non-confidence vote in Parliament, and a prime minister can also trigger an election. So while there is an outer deadline of about 3 years in this case, the exact timing is never fully settled. More important than the timetable, Poilievre says, is the way politics operates between elections. In Canada's parliamentary system, confrontation is constant. Rather than debating only occasionally during a campaign, the Prime Minister must regularly face the opposition in the House of Commons during question period. Poilievre notes that he can ask 6 questions in a row, pressing the government directly several times a week. Parliamentary committees then continue that scrutiny across areas like finance, healthcare, and natural resources. He says this creates a dual role for him. He is both the official opposition and a government in waiting. His job is not only to expose the government's failures, but also to persuade voters that he and his team are ready to take over. Rogan seems surprised by how permanent the campaign feels, but Poilievre argues that this is a strength of the system. In his view, democracy works better when the alternative to government is always visible. Asked how long he has been trying to become prime minister, Poilievre says almost exactly 4 years, tracing it to the launch of his leadership bid in February 2022. He says he once imagined making that run later in life, but the post-COVID political and economic climate pushed him forward sooner. He had become convinced that expanding government across Canada and the West would worsen inflation and hurt working people. From that concern came his slogan of making Canada the freest country on earth. To ground the idea in Canadian history, he cites Wilfrid Laurier's line that Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. The quote lets him frame freedom as a native Canadian ideal and presents him as a permanent challenger, preparing to govern in a system where democratic contest never really ends. Asked what he would do first as prime minister, Poilievre answers immediately: unblock our resources. He says Canada is extraordinarily resource-rich on a per capita basis, with huge oil, uranium, potash, natural gas, and critical mineral reserves, including 10 of NATO's 12 key defense minerals. To show why that matters, he points to specific uses: germanium for night vision, gallium for semiconductors and radar, aluminum for armored vehicles and aircraft, cobalt for fighter jet alloys, and tungsten for armor-piercing ammunition. His broader vision is for Canada to produce these resources at scale for itself and its allies, create high-paying trades jobs, build strategic stockpiles, and gain geopolitical leverage. But he argues none of that can happen under the current system, where permitting is slow, layered, and fragmented. His solution is a streamlined model: one project, one review, firm 6-month timelines, and pre-permitted zones where development can move ahead if companies meet preset conditions. Rogan raises an environmental objection, referencing stark images of Alberta oil extraction that looked like scorched earth. Poilievre rejects that characterization, calling Canadian oil sands production the most responsible in the world. He concedes that open-pit mines can look harsh in photographs, especially near Fort McMurray, but says companies restore the land afterward and do not cause lasting groundwater damage. He also stresses in situ extraction, where oil sands are accessed underground with steam, while the forest above remains largely undisturbed. He then extends the same argument to housing. In his view, the same bureaucracy slowing resource projects is also choking homebuilding in Canada and in places like California. Young people cannot afford homes because permits are too slow, development charges too high, and too much land is locked up. The answer, he says, is not more subsidy but fewer gatekeepers. Speed approvals, free land, cut taxes, and supply will rise. As proof, he points to Hardisty, a town of 600 in his district that supports roughly $100 billion in oil activity because local permitting is basically one page and 1 week. For Poilievre, that is the core formula. Canada's problem is not lack of potential, but bureaucracy blocking abundance. Economic decline is one of the episode's central themes, and Poilievre keeps returning to inflation. He calls money printing the biggest fraud perpetrated on the working-class people in the last 100 years. Using a simple analogy, if an economy has 10 apples and $10, each apple costs $1. Double the money to $20 without adding apples, and each apple costs $2. The apples did not become more valuable, the money became less valuable. He extends that logic to housing. In the U.S., he says, the number of homes roughly doubled over 55 years, from about 70 million to 150 million, while the money supply grew 30-fold. In his view, that imbalance drove housing prices up about 15 times and locked younger people out of ownership. He describes it as a massive wealth transfer from workers to elites, or from the have-nots to the have-yachts. When Rogan raises the U.S. national debt of $39 trillion, Poilievre notes it now exceeds GDP and argues that America has managed only because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. Canada has no such cushion. Its federal debt, he says, is around $1.3 trillion, and even more troubling once provincial debt is counted. His solution combines spending cuts with fiscal rules. He says he would reduce bureaucracy, consultants, foreign aid, corporate welfare, and payments tied to fraudulent refugee claims, while stressing that Canada is a nation of immigrants, and noting his wife came as a refugee from Venezuela. He argues recent population growth was too rapid, about 1 million people per year, which he says would be like the U.S. absorbing 10 million annually on a per capita basis. The result, he argues, was housing scarcity and overcrowding. His clearest reform proposal is a return to pay-as-you-go budgeting. Every new dollar spent should be matched by a dollar saved elsewhere. He points to the Clinton-era U.S. model, when the federal government briefly balanced the budget and paid down debt before deficits returned after PAYGO faded. For Poilievre, the core principle is scarcity. Ordinary people live within limits, and governments should be forced to do the same. The conversation broadens from economics into social decay, covering crime, health, food, and fitness as parts of a larger theory of social health. On crime, Poilievre argues Canada's justice system has become too permissive, especially on bail. While affirming innocence until proven guilty, he says repeat offenders with dozens or even hundreds of convictions should not be routinely released. His sharpest example is Vancouver, where he claims 40 people were arrested 6,000 times in 1 year, illustrating his view that a tiny group of chronic offenders commits a disproportionate share of crime, and that public safety would improve if they were simply kept off the streets. Rogan strongly agrees, tying it to no cash bail debates in U.S. cities like New York and Los Angeles. In his view, compassion should mean better schools, community centers, and real rehabilitation, not endless release cycles for habitual criminals. Both reject expert-led, soft-on-crime ideas and see public disorder as the predictable result. From there, the focus shifts to health, with Rogan leading. He argues the West, especially the U.S., is being damaged by processed food, inactivity, and bad incentives. Praising RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again message, he points to food dyes banned in Canada but allowed in similar American products. His rule is simple: eat real food, eggs, vegetables, meat, fish, fruit, and avoid products that last forever on shelves. Poilievre responds with his own habits, saying he has reduced carbs and often stays in ketosis, which he says makes him lighter, sharper, and less tired. Rogan adds that beef is nutritionally dense, and both criticize seed oils, sugar-heavy diets, and marketing that steers people toward cheap but empty calories. Fitness becomes the bridge between personal responsibility and social renewal. Rogan says the most effective intervention is communal movement: walking after dinner, yoga, light weights, any habit that gets people active together. Poilievre adds that youth sports kept him out of trouble. Together, they suggest that a healthier society requires not just less permissive crime policy, but stronger habits, better food, more movement, and a culture that rewards discipline and real community. The conversation's final stretch mixes tragedy, combat sports, and political philosophy into a revealing close. On opioids, both men are openly furious. Poilievre says Canada has lost more than 50,000 people to overdoses in the last decade, more than it lost fighting in the Second World War. Rogan points to the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma as examples of elite impunity, arguing the penalties they faced were tiny compared with their profits. Poilievre adds an even darker claim from U.S. litigation, that some distributors were allegedly paid bonuses tied to overdose rates, turning addiction and death into markers of commercial success. Their answer is treatment, recovery, and education rather than resignation. Poilievre praises abstinence-based centers, group counseling, exercise, and culturally grounded approaches such as sweat lodges in First Nations communities. He tells the story of a British Columbia man who survived a suicide attempt, got treatment, built a business, and now helps others escape addiction. Rogan brings up ibogaine as a promising therapy, citing Texas efforts supported by former Governor Rick Perry and claiming striking success rates after 1 or 2 sessions. Poilievre says he wants to learn more. From there, the mood shifts into an enthusiastic discussion of martial arts. They talk about Georges St. Pierre, Tristar, Firas Zahabi, Genevieve Theriault, and current UFC stars like Ilia Topuria. Rogan repeats one of his core ideas, that mixed martial arts has advanced more since 1993 than martial arts had in the previous 30,000 years. Poilievre is clearly in his element, asking informed questions about John Jones, Muay Thai in Thailand, the Gracies, and styles from Wing Chun to Krav Maga and Taekwondo. The exchange makes clear this interest is genuine. The episode ends by returning to freedom. Rogan argues adults should be allowed to smoke marijuana, drink whiskey, or eat a cheeseburger without government moralizing. Poilievre answers with his clearest summary: if you cannot trust a man to govern himself, how can you trust him to govern for others? He warns against handing power to people from ivory towers, and frames his political mission not as imposing his own grand legacy, but as making room for others to build theirs.